Hi, my name is Rihanna Pfefferkorn. I'm a research scholar at the Stanford Internet Observatory. I'm also a lawyer, but nothing I say in this talk is legal advice or the official position of SIO or of Stanford University. I'm here today to tell you something that might sound like a wild and crazy idea. Children deserve privacy too. People need privacy. It's essential to our humanity. Children are people. They have rights and dignity and agency, just like you and I do. Therefore, children need privacy. That's true both online and off. And it's up to us to respect and honor their privacy so that today's children can flourish into tomorrow's adults. But you don't have to take it from me. Just ask the federal government. Federal law protects children's privacy in multiple ways. For example, FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1974, which protects the confidentiality of student educational records. In general, schools can't disclose minor students' personally identifiable information in education records without a parental consent. COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act of 1998, which gives parents control over what information websites collect, use, or disclose about their children under the age of 13. And CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, and which regulates the confidentiality of states' reports and records on child abuse and neglect investigations. These privacy protections aren't absolute. Like any rule, they have exceptions. They strike a balance between privacy and other important competing interests, such as the health and safety of children or of the general public, or the ability of the justice system to gather evidence and conduct court proceedings. But note how laws like FERPA and COPPA, laws that have privacy right there in the name, make the choice to start from the baseline of protecting privacy. Then from there, they make carve-outs to that starting point in specific circumstances. Privacy is the default. In passing these laws, Congress decided to promote the socially desirable norm that children are entitled to privacy. But Congress recognized that children don't have the same power to protect and advocate for themselves as adults do, and so they needed some help. Of course, it's not just the child's interests that are being protected by these laws, it's the parents or guardians as well. Parents decide whether their kids' information can be collected or disclosed. Parents, not just kids, are entitled to confidentiality in child welfare investigations. It makes sense in situations like these, schools, the internet, child welfare agencies, to lump family members' interests together, at least to some extent. Parents are the head of the family. They're given legal power over their children. And these laws all talk about protecting information that is gathered, used, and disclosed by third parties outside of the family. But information about a child isn't a child. A child can't be defined by data alone. His grades, a past instance of abuse, the games he plays online, those don't capture who the child is. And the child isn't her parents. She's her own person. Even though parents have a lot of say over them, children have their own lives, including things they keep private from their parents. When we draw these distinctions, we illuminate the relationship between legal regulations governing information about children and the values that underpin those rules. That is, what are privacy laws for? The distinction that I'm getting at here is the distinction between two concepts: information privacy and autonomy privacy. Here's how the University of California defines these concepts. Information privacy means the appropriate protection, use, and dissemination of information about individuals. Autonomy privacy means an individual's ability to conduct activities without concern of or actual observation, i.e. surveillance. Autonomy privacy is what enables us to develop and grow as individuals, to learn and think and have frank, honest discussions and change our minds, to make decisions, to nurture relationships with other people, and to participate in our communities and in society. We would be severely stunted, not fully human, if we didn't have the privacy of the diary, the letter, the bedroom, the home, the doctor's office, the confessional, the voting booth, and the ballot. People change their behavior when they know or even just believe they're being watched. It affects their relationships. It affects what information they seek out. It affects what they're willing to say out loud. It affects their thoughts. Without autonomy privacy, people can't be themselves. I view information privacy as being in the service of autonomy privacy, as enabling autonomy privacy. If we are to be ourselves and engage with the different facets that make up a human life, we must not live with the constant fear that our every thought and word and action will be put on public display, to be criticized and ridiculed, mined for inconsistency or disloyalty, or exploited and monetized. That's what privacy laws like FERPA and COPPA are for. Information about you isn't you, but the loss of control over information about you can warp who you are. You can see the relationship between information privacy and autonomy privacy in how we explain the rationale behind the rules governing information privacy. Here's how Adopt US Kids instructs adoption and foster care professionals to draft a public profile about a child who's eligible for adoption. Children's public profiles must protect children's safety, privacy, and dignity. No one should be able to find the child using the information provided, and the child should not be embarrassed by any information contained within it. And here's what a federal judge wrote in a 2021 court decision about a statute the state of Colorado had enacted pursuant to CAPTA's confidentiality requirements. Children and their families who are subject to a child abuse or neglect investigation may experience stigma when their confidential information, including that contained in records or reports of child abuse or neglect, is disclosed in an identifying manner. The safety risk of being found by someone who doesn't have our best interests in mind, feelings of embarrassment, exposure to stigma in our community. Those are some of the harms that can result from the loss of control over information about ourselves. That's what information privacy laws and regulations are trying to protect. Rules controlling the flow of personal information ultimately exist to promote human dignity and human flourishing. And because children are humans, children need privacy in order to have dignity and to flourish. That doesn't just mean passing laws that enable parents to control what information gets collected or disclosed about their kids. It also means something that's more challenging: respecting the autonomy of children by recognizing that they deserve their own personal privacy, even from their parents. In some ways, child privacy is the last frontier. Laws like FERPA and COPPA are about children's information privacy with respect to third parties outside the family. Within the family, however, children's autonomy privacy largely remains more a matter of social norms than law. Over time, the law has put limits on parents' dominion over their children for the good of the child, and where those limits lie varies by state. Yet we still give parents much more legal leeway to intrude upon their minor children's privacy, to go through their belongings or open their mail or read their diary, than we give them to do things like violate their child's bodily autonomy through physical or sexual abuse, deny their child medical care or adequate nutrition, or keep their child out of school. There's a gap here between the law, which affords privacy rights to children's information, and the values that underpin the law, that autonomy privacy is a necessity for human dignity. There are perfectly understandable social and developmental reasons for this state of affairs. Society is reluctant to intrude on the privacy of the family, and so we continually tinker with the tricky balance between family privacy and the interests of the individual child, with different states striking different balances. And it's beyond question that kids need some amount of supervision to guide them safely into adulthood, because physically, mentally, and emotionally, they're not the same as adults. But they're not marionettes either. Adults can't control a child's every move. Kids need guardrails, but ultimately they have to become independent and self-reliant, make mistakes and grow from them, develop resilience, and generally take ownership of their own lives. We can see the values that autonomy privacy promotes reflected in a framework for children's digital well-being that was just released in a study last month, April 2022, from an international research project from UNICEF in conjunction with Western Sydney University and the LEGO Group. This framework was developed for the particular context of online play, but I think it's worth applying to concepts beyond play as well. These outcomes and indicators are based on what children themselves told the researchers behind this study, which reflects the voices of over 300 children from 13 countries who were part of the researchers' workshops. The framework states that key outcomes and indicators of digital well-being for children include, among others not shown in these slides, relaxing and regaining energy to engage with peers in the world, and improvements in their social engagement. These relate to autonomy privacy because privacy isn't just about the choice to be alone and disconnected from others. It's also what empowers us to choose when and how we engage with others and with the world around us. Autonomy privacy also is key to self-actualization by letting us become who we are and change over time. Under the safety and security outcome, privacy helps children to both feel and be safe while engaging with the digital environment by reducing worries about being watched, exposed, or targeted for harm. And finally, under empowerment, we see feelings of autonomy, choice, and agency. That's exactly what autonomy privacy is all about. I couldn't have stated it better myself. When we respect children's privacy as part of their growing autonomy, we help them to achieve these outcomes, both for their digital well-being and in the offline world as well. We give kids more and more autonomy as they get older and more mature. The challenge lies in figuring out what the appropriate level of autonomy is along the way. Too much autonomy, and that turns into parental neglect. Too little autonomy and an extremely controlling parent's actions become abuse. At either extreme, what we're looking at is an inappropriate exercise of the power that society gives parents over their children. In exchange for having that power over the child, parents also have responsibility for the child. The mistake lies in misusing that power in the name of exercising or abdicating that responsibility. When it comes to privacy, adults' legal power over children is in tension with their responsibility to children. Adults have the responsibility to make space for a child's growing autonomy. And that means exercising restraint when it comes to intruding on their privacy. Denying children the level of privacy appropriate to their age and maturity doesn't just do a disservice to the child, it also affects the adult's relationship with the child. The child may feel betrayed that the adult does not trust them and will distrust the adult in return. They may find ways to evade being monitored and may no longer see the adult as someone that they can talk to. What's more, I worry that privacy intrusions by well-meaning adults in the name of protecting a child's safety may paradoxically backfire and leave the child more susceptible to abusers. This is for two reasons: teaching children they have no power against adults and teaching children they can't trust adults. First, when we emphasize to children the power differential between them and adults, I worry that this inadvertently plays into the hands of abusers. My concern here isn't just about parents, it's more generally about a culture that normalizes that children aren't entitled to expect very much privacy from adults. Minimizing a child's entitlement to privacy and autonomy, whether that's through words or through deeds like going through their belongings or their phone, especially over their objections, risks teaching the child that she doesn't belong to herself, that she lacks agency and isn't entitled to set boundaries and enforce them, whereas adults get the power to ignore a child's boundaries. This risk seems all the greater when we consider that abusers are so often parents, the very adults who are legally entitled to invade children's privacy in ways they could not do to other adults. That makes it even harder to teach children a coherent message that it's okay for certain adults to invade their privacy, except when it's not. And that brings me to my second concern about how disregarding children's privacy in the name of their safety may backfire. If a child has learned to evade adults' monitoring as a way of seizing back their autonomy and no longer feels that the adults in their life are anybody that they can trust and talk to, then an adult who's responsible for a child's welfare may be less likely to find out if the child experiences an unsafe interaction. The monitoring won't work and the adult won't hear from the child personally. This isn't to say that the parents shouldn't keep tabs on their kids at all. It's just to say that denying children the privacy that they deserve is not a replacement for mutual trust and communication. Digital technologies put an additional twist on these intertwined issues of power and responsibility. Technology makes it easier than ever to surveil everything about your child, too little autonomy. And technology also makes it easier than ever to have no idea what's going on with your child, maybe too much autonomy. The relationship between information privacy and autonomy privacy, and the tension between knowing too much about a child's life and knowing too little, is where encryption becomes relevant. Encryption is a technology that protects our devices, online files, and online communications against would-be snoops. Here's the definition from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a digital rights organization based here in San Francisco. Generally, encryption refers to the mathematical process of making a message or other data unreadable except to a person who has the key to decrypt it into readable form. Encryption is a technical means of enforcing your intentions for who gets to read a file or listen in on a conversation. It enables us to choose whom to include or exclude from our zone of privacy. Encryption also has other uses, like preserving the integrity of information so that it can't be tampered with, or authenticating the sender of information. Strong encryption has been a huge boon for the privacy and security of our data. That goes for our devices and the things that we use them for. Device encryption protects your data if, for example, your smartphone falls into the wrong hands, so long as the phone isn't unlocked when that happens. Device encryption is built into many laptop models today, as well as your smartphone. Now that Apple and Android phones are strongly encrypted by default, they're not so easy to crack into for the thief who pilfers your phone from an unattended table in the coffee shop, or the taxi driver who finds it in the back seat after your ride. If you've got any intimate photos on your phone's camera roll, or you're logged into any banking apps, or the work email account where you send and receive sensitive information, it'll be harder for a snoop to get at them, at least if you've picked a strong passcode for your phone and not 123456. Likewise, encryption for messaging apps such as iMessage, WhatsApp, and Signal. These chat apps encrypt all of your messages by default in such a way that only you and the person you're talking to can read what they say. Not even the company that provides the app, like Apple, which makes iMessage, or Facebook, which owns WhatsApp, can read your end-to-end encrypted messages. Anybody eavesdropping on your conversation as it flies over the wires will see only gobbledygook, even the company itself. And all those apps I mentioned that employ this level of encryption, known as end-to-end encryption by default, meaning you don't have to do anything to get that protection when you communicate with another user of the app. You don't have to fiddle with the app's settings, it just works. Note, though, that if you use an iPhone to message a non-iPhone user, those messages, the ones that show up in green, aren't end-to-end encrypted. Only the ones in blue are, the ones that you exchange with other iPhone users. So on one level, encryption protects information privacy. It keeps information confidential. Someone who doesn't have the key to decrypt encrypted information will just see a meaningless scramble. On another level, though, encryption promotes autonomy privacy. It serves human dignity by empowering people to keep our conversations and our documents, which reveal so much about us, our interests, our innermost thoughts, secure from prying eyes. That includes kids. Encryption also helps to enforce children's wishes for privacy. And kids express those wishes all the time. When a child has a whispered conversation with her best friend in the corner of the playground, or makes up a special language that only the two of them know, when a child writes in her diary with its little lock and key and stows it under her mattress, they're evincing a desire for privacy, so they can think their thoughts and talk to their friends without worrying about eavesdropping eyes and ears. Encryption for chat apps and smartphones is like the digital equivalent of whispering so nobody else can hear, making up a secret language, or keeping a diary under lock and key. But it's stronger and more sophisticated than those classic examples from the brick and mortar world. Pig Latin is not an impenetrable secret language, and I know from my own childhood experience that the little locks on those diaries are very flimsy. Encryption is essential to protecting children. That's particularly true of the vulnerable populations that you here today work with, such as children who suffer from domestic abuse, or members of marginalized groups, such as LGBTQIA kids. And I'm not just talking about protecting digital privacy. Encryption also enables free expression and even protects physical safety. Encrypted chat apps empower children to communicate with other kids and trusted adults, to talk about difficult things or share secrets with them, free from fear of being watched. Encryption enables abused kids, LGBTQIA kids, and other at-risk kids to reach out safely to others so they can seek help, receive emotional and mental health support, ask questions, get vital information, and learn about resources available to them, and just know that they're not alone. These apps are even more powerful when they have features such as disappearing messages, a feature that's becoming increasingly common both in messaging apps that are end-to-end encrypted by default and those that aren't. In addition to these features, smartphone encryption also helps protect kids' physical safety, because when a device is locked, it's harder for an abusive parent to get into a child's phone and see who they're talking to and what they're saying. Taken together, these features can keep an abusive parent from finding the child's text messages with a crisis hotline, or accessing a child's phone and seeing photos on their camera roll that document evidence of physical or sexual abuse, or of a gender identity or sexuality that the child has kept secret from the parent for fear of being physically punished or suffering other repercussions, such as being thrown out of their home, for which queer and trans kids are at a far greater risk than the general child population. Of course, there are two sides to any technology. Technology is just a tool. It's a thing that enables a person to carry out that person's purpose, whether that purpose is good, bad, or neutral. Anybody who's played the board game Clue knows that something as innocuous as a candlestick or a rope can be put to multiple different uses. There are two sides to any technology, and that's true of encryption and other privacy-enhancing technologies too. Encryption is a vitally important tool in modern society, not least because it shields children's privacy and helps keep them safe from hackers and criminals. But a child can also use privacy-enhancing technologies, such as encrypted apps and devices or disappearing messages, to hide stuff from their parents, stuff the parent might wish to know, but that the child has their own reasons not to share. And encryption can also shield the activities of those who seek to harm children. That's because, as I said, when a company like Facebook makes an end-to-end encrypted chat app, it can't monitor what its users are saying or see what files they're sending each other. So it's harder for the company to know if someone is having an unsafe conversation with a child or sharing illegal images of children. Although, as I'll discuss later in this talk, my own research shows that such companies do have other techniques available for fighting abuse on their services. Likewise, when a company like Apple makes encrypted devices that the company itself can't unlock, it's not as straightforward as it used to be for investigators to get into a suspect's or victim's phone to look for evidence of a crime. Although I'll note that many law enforcement agencies across the US have access to tools for getting into locked phones, even if Apple doesn't. So encryption, like any technology, can be used to protect ourselves and our children, and it can also be used by wrongdoers. But it's important to keep something in perspective. Most people are not child abusers. That may be easy to lose sight of if your day-to-day work often exposes you to the fraction of the population who are. But this means that most smartphone owners and users of encrypted apps aren't child abusers either. WhatsApp alone, the most popular end-to-end encrypted chat app today, has over 2 billion active users. That's about a quarter of the entire population of Earth. A lot of people's privacy and security, including a lot of children's, is being protected without all those users ever needing to think about it. And the vast, vast majority of those people aren't criminals. The double-sided nature of technological tools is also true of the technologies that parents can use to keep tabs on their kids. These include location tracking features that let a parent know the location of the child's device, such as the iPhone feature for sharing the device's location with family members. And more intrusively, software that can be installed on a child's phone that gives the parent a view of everything the child does on the phone. With one of these monitoring apps installed, the adult doesn't need to physically get access to the unlocked phone each time they want to check up on their child's online activities, or to snoop on the child even when the child isn't using the phone at the moment. As the British newspaper The Guardian reported just a few days ago on May 1st of this year, in addition to the many options on the market for tracking your child's location, one parental surveillance app promises to provide screenshots of your child's online activity. And another even lets parents activate the microphone on your child's phone remotely so you can eavesdrop on their interactions. On the one hand, such monitoring technologies might seem beneficial to parents. Where is your child? What are they doing online? Who are they talking to? Is anything inappropriate going on? In the name of ensuring a child's safety, a well-meaning parent may want to install these tools on their kid's phone, maybe with the child's knowledge and after discussion with the child, maybe not. But let's be clear, these are surveillance tools, they're spyware, and they invade the child's privacy in ways that are indisputably creepy, inappropriate, and in many cases illegal when used on the phones of unsuspecting adults who have more rights than children do. Remotely turning on the microphone on an adult's phone without their knowledge or consent to eavesdrop on that person's conversations is super illegal. Think about how violative it would be to use these same tools on adults without their knowledge or their freely given consent. as all too many abusive domestic partners and ex-partners do to their victims' phones, often using these very same apps, which now tend to be euphemistically marketed as being for parental control and not stalking your spouse or your ex. Framed this way, that can help you to understand the dark side of these surveillance tools in the context of children too. The same technologies that may appeal to caring parents can also be exploited by abusive parents to control and harm their children. Same technologies, different uses. In those hands, these tools' privacy invasive properties make the child less safe, not more. Last summer, a controversy erupted that wound up providing an instructive case study of a technology that was intended to increase child safety, but which its designers didn't realize would inadvertently put some children at risk. In August 2021, Apple announced a plan to add several child safety features to iPhones. The company has developed a reputation for protecting its users' privacy and security, including by minimizing the amount of data it collects and stores about its users, especially compared to other data-hungry big tech companies, making iPhones encrypted by default so that it can't extract data from an iPhone even for law enforcement, and making iMessage end-to-end encrypted by default so that it can't snoop on iPhone users' messaging conversations. But in recent years, Apple has also taken some flack for supposedly not doing enough about child safety on its devices and services. Last summer's plan was intended to address that. Apple's plan had three components to it. The one that was totally uncontroversial involved users' queries in Siri, Spotlight, or Safari search. If a user searches for information on how to report child sexual exploitation, the results will point them to resources for where and how to file a report. If a user's search query relates to child sexual exploitation, like searching for that kind of material, the response will be that that's a harmful and problematic interest to have and offer resources to get help. This feature has been rolled out on iPhones now. The part of Apple's plan that was the most controversial was a proposal to scan all photos uploaded to iCloud from the camera roll on an iPhone to look for child sex abuse imagery before the uploads hit the cloud. I was one of many voices in the privacy and cybersecurity community who pushed back against this proposal. It's pretty standard practice at this point for tech companies to scan files that users have decided to transmit from their device to look for child sex abuse imagery, such as files that are in cloud storage already or that a user attaches to an email message. Scanning in the cloud has privacy implications too, of course, but at this point, most of the big players do it. But moving that scanning technology down onto the device itself in order to look for that information before it ever hits the cloud in the end was an unheard of level of invasion of privacy. The idea crossed a line that hadn't been crossed before. In fact, just before Apple announced this plan, two researchers at Princeton had published a paper wherein they envisioned a very similar design to Apple's, and they concluded that it was too dangerous to deploy in real life. iCloud isn't end-to-end encrypted, so Apple could scan files once they were uploaded to iCloud, which, as I said, is what other cloud storage services generally do. But Apple thought it would be more privacy protective to scan on the device in the process of having the photo get uploaded to iCloud. However, Apple misjudged how icky it makes people feel to think of a big tech company snooping around in their personal private phones, a phone that Apple sold you and that you supposedly own and control. Thanks to the outcry, Apple put this part of its three-part plan on hold. So far, as of early May 2022, there have been no public announcements about what Apple will do instead. The third and final part of Apple's plan was somewhat controversial, but less so than the photo scanning part. This feature has been rolled out with some changes from the original plan. Apple calls it communication safety in messages. It's not turned on by default. It's an opt-in feature that parents can select if their child's device is on Apple's family sharing plan for iCloud. Basically, it's a nudity filter. It warns the child if the Messages app detects that a child is sending or receiving a photo containing nudity. The phone will blur the photo, and the child will be warned, presented with helpful resources, and reassured that it's okay if they don't want to view the photo. Likewise, if the child attempts to send a photo containing nudity rather than receive one, there are similar measures, and the child will be encouraged not to send the photo. In both cases, the child is given the option to message a grown-up for help. Because these messages are end-to-end encrypted, Apple can't access the messages itself. The nudity filter works on the device, and no information about the message or the image gets sent to Apple. Originally, Apple's plan was to automatically send a notification to parents if a child under 13 sent or received an image containing nudity in the Messages app. Just a notification, not the image itself. Then the idea was that the parent could ask the child to show them the message. Parents wouldn't be notified if the child was 13 or older, in recognition of the fact that, say, a 16-year-old just isn't the same as, say, a 10-year-old. Age and maturity level matter in this area. Ultimately, however, Apple changed its plan so that notifications will never be sent to parents, no matter what the child's age. This was also a result of the huge outcry I mentioned from privacy, safety advocates, and the security community. We warned that notifying parents, the feature that Apple intended to help parents protect a child's privacy, could in some cases lead to a parent harming a child's safety. As I said, a child's photo could show evidence of physical or sexual abuse, and the child might want to send that photo to somebody to document the abuse and seek help. Or a child who's secretly trans might document their body and send it to a friend their age, only for the notification to out them to a transphobic parent. Just like we've been discussing, the exact same technology could be used for good or for bad. Parental notifications about potential nude images in a messaging app are a lot like those child monitoring apps I mentioned. They can also be used by abusive parents for bad purposes, so they just aren't an easy answer to the question of how do we keep kids safe when they're using digital technology. What I find astonishing is the fact that not all children have safe homes and safe parents honestly seem never to have occurred to Apple. But I'm glad that they were responsive to feedback and took measures to make their child safety features safer. So what keeps children safe in Apple's revised plan for messages? More privacy and more autonomy. Instead of notifying parents that they may be sending or receiving nude images, Apple's revised plan keeps the control in the hands of the child. It blurs the images, yes, and provides warnings, guidance, and reassurance to the child, and it gives them the option to contact a grown-up. This approach emphasizes agency over surveillance, even for younger children. Apple's revised plan is more in harmony with comments made by a technologist at the ACLU named Daniel Kahn-Gilmore, who said this of Apple's original plan at the time Apple rolled it out. If what we say to kids is, here's your safety tool, and it's safe because somebody's surveilling you, well, we shouldn't be surprised if those kids become adults who equate surveillance with safety. I view working for people to have effective privacy as also being a child safety concern. He's right. We shouldn't view child privacy and online safety as being at odds with each other. They're not incompatible goals. In my own recently published research, I show that the providers of online services have other strategies available to them for fighting various types of abuse online, including those that particularly affect children, besides just snooping through everybody's files and conversations. This research was published in early 2022 in Volume 2 of the Journal of Online Trust and Safety, which is a peer-reviewed multidisciplinary journal founded by my colleagues and I at Stanford. I'll toss up a link to the paper at the end. My goal in undertaking this research was to learn more about what I refer to as content-oblivious techniques that the providers of various online services employ in their so-called trust and safety programs, which are how providers try to detect and combat abuse on their services. The terminology that I deploy in this research pits content-dependent trust and safety techniques against content-oblivious trust and safety techniques. By content-dependent, I mean techniques such as automated scanning of the contents of files, such as photo-DNA, which you may have heard of, or review by human moderators. Techniques that necessarily depend upon the provider having at-will access to the contents of everybody's files and communications. That's by contrast to what I call content-oblivious techniques, such as analyzing metadata about a file, or when users report abuse that the provider wouldn't have found itself, as well as things like limiting how many people there can be in a group or how many times you can forward a particular message. These are strategies for doing trust and safety that do not require the provider to have at-will access to the contents of every message in every file. Among the survey participants, my analysis includes, in total, the responses of 13 recipients, some of whom chose to be anonymous as to the services about which they were responding. Several of the participating services are end-to-end encrypted messaging apps, but most of them are not. Of the ones that chose not to be anonymous, those include Facebook, which responded as to the Facebook Messenger, Instagram messaging, and WhatsApp services, Wikimedia Foundation, which responded as to its Wikidata service, the now defunct Yahoo Groups, and two small so-called link aggregation sites. The participating services range in size from around 2,000 monthly active users on the small end to WhatsApp, which as said has over 2 billion active users. So while 13 is a pretty small sample size, collectively we're talking about services that collectively serve many, if not most, of the world's internet users. In my survey, I referred to a list of several different types of abuse. Here are the 12 categories that I included in this survey, plus other. Intellectual property infringement, spam, phishing or malware, child sex abuse imagery, or CSAI for short, child sexual exploitation besides imagery, meaning things like grooming or enticement, CSE for short, terrorism or violent extremism, non-child pornography, sexual content or obscenity, mis and disinformation, harassment, threats, extortion, sextortion, and intimidation, hate speech, self-harm, and bots or inauthentic behavior. Hopefully, overall, these categories capture the major kinds of abuse that happen online. In this and the next two charts, blue is used for the 10 large providers that participated in the survey, such as WhatsApp, which have tens or even hundreds of millions or even billions of users, whereas red is for the 3 small providers whose monthly active users number only in the thousands. So I began by asking what techniques the survey respondents use to fight abuse. This chart shows how many participants use any given technique out of the ones that I asked about. The results show that user reporting is the most popular of the abuse detection techniques I asked about. All 13 participants said that they employ some kind of user reports to fight abuse, either reports that you can submit in-app and/or reports that are submitted from outside of the service. 12 out of the 13 said that their service uses in-app reports, and the 13th accepts off-app reports. Going forward, the survey questions focused on 3 particular techniques: automated scanning, metadata, and user reporting. Remember, the first one, automated scanning, is content dependent, and the other 2, metadata and user reports, are content oblivious. So how many services use metadata to detect each of the 12 kinds of abuse I asked about? Here we see that the number of providers for any given category tops out at 9 for bots and for spam, followed by 8 for CSAI and for phishing or malware. And then it goes down from there. Note that there's no category where every single survey participant said that they use metadata to detect that particular category of abuse. Indeed, there's very low usage of metadata in certain categories, such as hate speech and self-harm. Next, let's look at how many services use user reporting, another content oblivious technique, to detect each type of abuse. Here, we see higher numbers overall than we saw with metadata, topping out at 11 for spam, followed by 9 for bots, harassment, and phishing or malware. Again, even though for most of the categories, more services employ user reports than said they use metadata, there is still no category where every single survey participant uses this technique. But even on the low end, the low numbers, like for IP infringement, are still higher than they were for metadata. In what I consider the most interesting finding from the survey, I asked, which tool did the service providers that I surveyed find most useful for detecting each type of abuse? I gave 3 options: automated scanning, shown in blue, metadata, shown in red, and user reporting, shown in yellow. With a notable exception of CSAI, the option that prevails here across a majority of categories is user reports. User reporting of abuse either meets or beats the other 2 approaches' usefulness for every type of abuse except CSAI, where we see that automated scanning is by far the most popular answer. The 2 content oblivious options don't even come close. Near the bottom, we also see in 2 areas a tie between automated scanning and one or both content oblivious techniques. Those 2 areas are child sexual exploitation, where automated scanning ties with user reports, and spam, where there's a 3-way tie. Overall, automated systems, whether for analyzing metadata or content, lose out to human judgment, even at the massive scale at which some of my survey respondents operate. So what does this imply about the impact of end-to-end encryption on a provider's ability to detect abuse? Recall that end-to-end encryption hinders access to the contents of files or communications. The provider can't see the content. That means that end-to-end encryption impedes automated scanning because automated scanning is content dependent, but it doesn't impede user reporting or metadata because they are not. I find that user reporting meets or beats automated scanning in terms of perceived utility for all abuse types except for CSAI. The implication there is that end-to-end encryption does not impact a provider's abuse detection efforts uniformly. Rather, end-to-end encryption's impact on abuse detection probably varies depending on what type of abuse we're talking about. We can expect there to be the least impact from turning on end-to-end encryption, where content oblivious tools are considered much more useful than automated scanning. The examples we saw in the data include harassment, hate speech, and self-harm. We can expect there to be some impact in areas of abuse where content oblivious tools are considered to be about as useful as automated scanning. And the examples we saw in the data are sexual exploitation of children, such as grooming or enticement, and spam. And we can expect there to be the greatest impact by end-to-end encryption on a provider's trust and safety techniques and their ability to detect abuse for areas of abuse where content oblivious tools are considered to be much less useful than automated scanning. And the only example that we see in the data is CSAI. The takeaway here is that there just aren't any one-size-fits-all answers to the complex problem of online abuse. We can't treat every type of abuse the same as though it's CSAI. CSAI, as the data shows, is unique. What works best against it is not what works best against all the other types of abuse that I asked about, or vice versa. We can't accurately forecast the impact of end-to-end encryption on abuse detection efforts based on CSAI alone. The unique context of CSAI just cannot serve as the basis for designing an anti-abuse program in a trust and safety team at a provider, nor can it serve as the basis for designing laws to regulate the providers of online services. Online abuse simply is not a uniform problem, and so there isn't a silver bullet that will work against the whole thing. Automated scanning doesn't serve as a silver bullet. It might not even work best against CSAI forever. But content oblivious tools such as metadata analysis aren't a silver bullet either. After all, tools like metadata analysis, which is content oblivious, still have privacy implications, even if they are not peering at the contents of files and communications the way a content-dependent technique such as automated scanning does. Nevertheless, there is some low-hanging fruit. I would like to see providers improve their abuse reporting tools to cover more of the types of abuse that users are likely to encounter on their service. And those reporting tools should be designed with children's needs in mind, not just the needs of adult users. To close, here are some recommendations from me, many of which I've borrowed from the social media tips PDF for foster parents and caregivers that I've linked to down in the resources section. You can also see the link to my article, plus my contact information on email and Twitter. My recommendations to start with are: talk with children, not to, with. Build trust with them, trust that goes both ways. Set rules for what's okay and what's not okay when using the internet, and revisit those rules as the kid ages and matures. Explain the reasons for the rules in an age-appropriate way so that they don't seem arbitrary. Providing guidance and boundaries for kids' online activities is especially important if there are forbidden adults, such as family members, who are not allowed to contact a child, whether unsupervised or at all. Social media games and chat apps can be channels to try to circumvent those limits. Ask kids to show you the apps and games that they use on their phone or their computer. Explore the app's settings for privacy and safety together. Choose the strongest possible privacy settings, both to limit who can find or contact the child on that account and to minimize corporate data collection. Teach kids to keep their personal information private online, such as their full name, their home address, their phone number, where they go to school, and other identifying information. Make sure children understand that they do not have to put up with online or real-life interactions that make them feel uncomfortable or unsafe, and that if they come to you with a problem, you will help them. Together, make a list of trusted adults in addition to you that the child can go to for help. And finally, the monitoring apps that I discussed earlier carry privacy, legal, and cybersecurity risks. Some monitoring apps have suffered hacks and data breaches. These can increase the risk of identity theft. Do your consumer research. Look up legal boundaries too. Adults who are not parents or legal guardians may not have the right to install a monitoring app on a child's device. Plus, monitoring a child's conversations with others may implicate those others' legal rights, such as under state wiretapping laws. Find out what monitoring software your child's school may have installed on a child's computer. This software has been controversial because it can be both error-prone and extremely privacy intrusive. It may even capture the activities of other people in the room with the child, such as you. Consider other alternatives before resorting to a monitoring app that intrudes on personal privacy and may have shoddy cybersecurity. Finally, don't keep monitoring apps installed after a child hits age 18. Thanks for listening. Let's close out the hour by shifting to a Q&A session between me and Kyle Conway of Prevent Child Abuse, Iowa.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a pre-recorded talk, and so we decided to have kind of a pre-recorded Q&A session, and we reached out to a number of people in the community. We reached out to a lot of the people that we work with throughout the state of Iowa to kind of ask questions before they've heard your talk, right? So it's a little bit strange in that way, but about kind of this topic of how does technology sort of affect what's going on with kids. And your talk has a very provocative title, right? Children deserve privacy too. And so we've kind of collected some of these questions together, and we'll just go through them now. And then I think if people have additional questions, they should definitely send them to us, and we'll try to get more people to talk about them in the future.
I mean, I guess the easiest answer to that is just that technology mediates like every aspect of our lives at this point. And so how we interact with and regulate technology, as a big of a word as that means, because that means everything from like an electric toothbrush to like a nuclear reactor, how we make those regulations affects our lives in various ways that we may not even think about on like a day-to-day level. So it can have wide-ranging effects. So to talk about online safety, for example, you and I are speaking over Zoom. Mm-hmm. Some of the big issues that Zoom has had to think about, especially since it exploded in popularity over the last couple of years, is how to provide privacy and security for our conversations. We don't necessarily need to think about that when we just fire up a Zoom session, but it's something where Zoom has to comply with applicable laws regarding consumer protection and thinking about wiretapping and thinking about all of the other applicable, state and federal regulations, including in, other countries where they do business. And so it's like any other aspect of sort of the regulatory environment, is that we're sort of soaking in it at all times. And when it comes to technology, because we're using technological tools as part of our jobs, as part of interacting with kids are using them for school, all of those things come into play. And so needing to care about technology laws is kind of like, well, why should I care about traffic laws, or why should I care about food safety laws? That it affects your job and your tasks, and it affects their day-to-day lives, sometimes in ways that we may be very aware of. I think kids actually have a pretty well-honed sense of how they think about their privacy and their interactions online, for example, and sometimes in ways that we just don't even need to think about. Like, I just don't need to worry that this building is going to fall down around my ears because we have building safety regulations, for example. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but I just sort of want to highlight the fact that so much of what we do is mediated now, even to the degree that a lot of the jobs of folks who attend this conference are still so focused on like face-to-face, in-person, personal relationships with the children and the adults who are their clients. I mean, I think that there is some value to seeing the debates and anxieties over things like social media or chat apps as being an extension of every generation's moral panic that you mentioned, whether that's around Dungeons and Dragons, whether that's around explicit content in song lyrics, or playing a record backwards for satanic messages or whatever, and reflecting, I guess, perpetual generational anxieties about like, are our kids going to be okay? Are they going to grow into, safe, secure, well-rounded, healthy adults? And being afraid of different influences that may be exerting unhealthy, consequences upon them. I do think that when we talk about technology with respect to social media and the internet, part of it does feel different, in part because, as I mentioned, this just permeates every aspect of life. Especially when you have to do Zoom school, when you have to put your lesson plan online and do online apps for submitting your homework, when all of your friends are in different social media apps, it feels less like something that you can opt out from than if you just didn't want to play Dungeons and Dragons, or you didn't have any interest in, heavy metal music or whatever it might be. It's a little more inescapable. And also just the reach of it and the speed and the virality of so much of it also has a different sort of effect than when our communities were smaller and when it costs a lot of money just to make a phone call, to the next state over, as opposed to easily being able to interact with anybody on the planet now at this point. And I think that has a lot of benefits insofar as it makes it a lot easier to see life through the eyes of people who have a very different life experience than your own, or to have any amount of information immediately at your fingertips. These are the promises and the benefits that we were looking forward to from the internet in the 1990s. But at the same time, it has made it easier, I guess, also to access the darker sides of things that are more harmful. And so as these sorts of technologies have taken over daily life, it has made it more important and more salient, I guess, to try and equip children and to equip ourselves as adults for whom technology maybe changes faster than we can keep up with, where maybe kids are a little better able to handle those sorts of rapid changes, for us to have these conversations about what this all means, to work at figuring out media literacy strategies and how to bring, I guess, the kinds of values or lessons that we grew up with in terms of consuming information, and also look for the benefits that are out there and try to focus on that while also figuring out different ways to mediate the harm. So I agree that it can be different overall in feeling, but I do, I guess, want to caution against going too far into more of the moral panic kind of posture that you were talking about. This is such a big challenge because technology does not have all the answers. We can't look to technology to provide all of these solutions here because we can't use technology alone to reliably detect when grooming is happening. And that's something that makes grooming different from imagery regarding child sexual abuse, where there are these sophisticated automated systems that exist to detect known images of abuse, not necessarily never before seen ones, that's slightly different, but at least with known imagery, we have tools for catching that, right? In my research, I've found that tech companies are ambivalent about what works best for detecting grooming, even though they agree strongly that those automated tools are the best way for detecting abusive imagery. Grooming is a trickier problem that might involve sending a child inappropriate images, it might involve sexualized talk, but it might involve euphemisms or veiled language, and that's subtler and it's harder to detect through automated systems. And so tech companies know that this is a tough challenge. They're working on ways to detect inappropriate interactions between an adult and a child who are using their product, whether that's a social media platform, private messaging app, gaming, and different companies analyze different data for these detection purposes. So depending on what app or product we're talking about, it's probably going to look a little different. But part of what grooming makes such a challenge is that grooming is not just a stranger danger issue, and it doesn't just happen online. It can be that kind of fact pattern where a stranger contacts a child online and ends up enticing them into an unsafe situation face-to-face, or soliciting inappropriate photos from them over the internet in an extortion kind of a fact pattern. But sometimes grooming comes from an adult who's part of a child's life. And in those cases, it's not weird for the adult to be Facebook friends with a bunch of kids on their social graph if that's somebody who's the coach of a school sports team. It's not weird for an adult in one state to message a child in another state if it's that child's uncle, right? And that is where it is a lot harder for technology alone to look and find something that may be inappropriate, not only because there are ways where those conversations may just by default not be suspicious, just for any interaction with an adult to be, with a child to be considered suspicious, I think is a presumption of guilt over innocence that I don't know if we want to adhere to, but also because it may only be one facet of a larger grooming relationship that may happen offline in areas that, if you have one app or one service, it only sees like the one little window onto what is happening. And it can be very difficult to handle those situations. When I've talked to people who work at platforms, they say, this is the hardest thing, is where these kinds of abuse happen within a family unit or within a social relationship that is not going to be flagged as unusual or suspicious by their systems, because it is just part of what we use communication systems for, is to talk to our loved ones or to talk to the people who are part of our lives. And so that's why tech companies can't be expected to solve the whole problem, because they don't create the whole problem. They're not to blame for offline real world relationships that lead to offline real world abuse, given that they only have this one window. And that means that some grooming will fly under their radar. And like I said, on the flip side, I don't know that we want to move to a world where by default we treat any interaction between adults and children online with suspicion and presume guilt rather than innocence. Most adults, most teachers, most sports coaches are not sexual predators. Most adults aren't sexual predators, period. But that's something that's really difficult, I think, to keep in mind when your whole job is only seeing this slice of the worst case scenarios, right? But just as kids need to learn how to interact with and talk to adults in real life and practice those skills, while also, having the knowledge of, we talked earlier about their bodily integrity and about consent and so forth, they also need to learn how to interact with adults online, whether that's playing an online game or whether that is, posting on a message board where you're all fans of the same musical artist or whatever it might be. So grooming, I think, is one of these really tricky areas where we can try and teach children about appropriate and inappropriate behavior online, and teach them about like not creating and sending sexual images of yourself to anybody who asks for it, whether that's another child from school or whether that's an adult who's known to you or whether that's a stranger who's not known to you. But because the reality, as I understand it, is that so much abuse comes from within the family unit, or at least within the greater sort of social circle of a child, we have to put that in perspective with stranger danger, which is one part of it. But even when we were going all the way back to the 1980s and the original stranger danger panic, it was still such a minority of the kinds of negative situations that arise compared to somebody's actual life. So I think that's also just an important thing to keep perspective on. And there are tips out there for, how do we figure out how to keep these communications channels and social media from being used by adults who, if you're a caseworker or whatever, those are off limits to the kid, right? And not to let those become a channel for an adult who has been, restricted from contact with a child in their family, or who they've been taken out of their home or whatever, to use that to sort of circumvent those limitations. And that may be something to be more on the eye out for than just the stranger situation, although that's certainly one part of it.
There's this, it's interesting to think about, tech companies actually wrestling with these problems and thinking about them. I don't know that everyone is aware that that's happening, but also thinking about how the tech company kind of has to deal with this in a contextless fashion. They don't know you really. They don't know your family really. They might know that you have a relationship status of mother, daughter, niece, uncle, something like that, because you've put it into a field somewhere. But otherwise, they're just kind of making contextless assumptions. And one of the things that we try to focus on is having parents talk to their kids, right? It's important to talk to them. That's one of the themes that's come up kind of frequently in this conversation, is like, technology doesn't really solve the problem. A lot of the time communication does, being able to have open communication, understand what everyone is doing. And it sounds like one of the problems there would be, sometimes this happens and it's in a family. And for a tech company to deal with that, they would either have to be invading privacy in some sort of very strange way, or they would have to maybe be more suspicious of, for instance, a parent using technology of the 21st century to have a conversation with their child that we would think is completely appropriate. It just happens to be about subjects that often are in this other realm. Like, is that kind of accurate? Like, is there, it feels like kind of like a double-edged sword. Like there's not a straightforward solution there that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. And tech companies have a big job in terms of trying to figure out all the different ways that their tools get used for harm rather than for good, whether that is, scams and ripoffs and fraud, or whether that is, child abuse type situations. And like you said, the double-edged sword here is that we can't tech our way and we can't surveil our way out of social problems or out of abusive situations. And so the more information that we provide to various tech companies, yes, the more that potentially they could use that to build and deploy tools to provide greater safety, but like the more that also means an intrusion into our privacy, right? As we worry about how much information is known about us and how that information gets used, feeding everything about ourselves into and our kids into various online platforms is something that maybe people are thinking twice about now, after I think just kind of going along with it because of the obvious benefits without necessarily seeing quite so obviously what the long-term drawbacks might have been. This is something that is a big issue that a lot of companies wrestle with, is that the more that they know about you, the more that they have to keep that information secure, right? And keep it secure against being hacked or breached. And we're thinking about how to regulate that. But the less that a company knows about you, on some level, that does restrict the sorts of things that they are able to do in terms of deploying safety tools. And I think they're in a tough position because there are all these demands that are both like keep us very safe and prevent abuse, but also do it in a way that is completely privacy respecting, and stop collecting so much information about us. And it's difficult. And just, to reiterate something that I think you said at the outset, doing this perfectly at massive scale is literally impossible. Like there are these tools that are being developed and deployed by most of the types of tech companies and apps that we use on a day-to-day basis. But we're going to hear about how they fail or where they don't work out perfectly, or where they end up being overly censorious. Like, why did this tool keep this uncle from talking to their, niece or nephew? And that will stimulate just as much, puzzlement and anger as if a stranger had been allowed to, reach out to a child and, do something inappropriate in that interaction. At the sorts of scale that we're talking about, where there are billions of people online now and hundreds of millions or even billions of people use some of the most popular apps and platforms out there, getting it right 100% of the time is just literally not possible. And so there are ever evolving tools to try and deal with these challenges. But this is something that I try and emphasize in some of my current research. Like, abusers are always evolving how they figure out how to circumvent any of those tools to find new ways to get back onto platforms they've been banned from, or to contact people that don't want to talk to them, or to engage in the behaviors that we keep trying to tamp down on in order to minimize the mess while enhancing the good facets. So I guess, it's important to both call for greater accountability or figure out where the tools that are in place are not working, such as, if there are gaps in the reporting features for reporting different types of abuse, which is something that I found in my research, that providers don't consistently have a way to granularly report the different types of abuse that their users may encounter online. But at the same time, bear in mind that this is such a large and complex and evolving challenge, and that there are inherently going to be trade-offs involved in terms of what happens if tools get it wrong out of trying to go too far in the direction of finding everything at the outset. That might result in, as I mentioned earlier, some beneficial speech being excluded, or it might mean collecting a lot more information with the accompanying intrusion into privacy in the name of trying to provide greater safety.
Fantastic. Well, listen, we'd love to talk forever, but thank you very, very, very much for your time. And we really appreciate you coming to the conference and speaking.
Thank you for having me.